And I'm very happy to introduce Saraya AlSaffar as our first presenter. And Saraya is doing a presentation on CRISPR technology in Islam, and Dr. Mark Cherry, the advisor, is here as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Saraya AlSaffar. I am a bioinformatics major here at St. Edward's University, and I'll be presenting to you my thesis on CRISPR technology from the perspective of Islam. Next slide. So, if you don't know what CRISPR technology is, what you do need to know is that it raises a lot of ethical concerns, especially from the religious community. And part of those concerns cover unintended consequences, whether it should be used for cosmetic purposes and designer babies, and also other genetic enhancements that we will go into in more detail later on. And for that reason, I decided that I thought writing my thesis on how Islam would view CRISPR technology would be a great way to evaluate it, especially because I am Muslim myself, and I thought this would be a creative way to learn more about my religion through CRISPR. Next slide. And so, CRISPR was originally found accidentally in bacteria. It's an adaptive immune system in bacteria that uses viral DNA to develop a CRISPR array. The CRISPR array stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Palindromic Regions. These are segments in the DNA of the bacteria composed of small chunks of viral DNA that are then transcribed and cut up into free-floating molecules that will then latch onto foreign viral DNA and start an immune response against them. And so, if that same virus were to inject that DNA into the bacteria, it would signal to the cell that it needs to be attacked and destroyed. Next slide. So, this mechanism was basically hijacked by scientists to make gene edits. And for this presentation, we will specifically be talking about germline gene editing. This involves editing reproductive cells and not all the other cells that are in our bodies. And so how it's being used is that you have these molecules which uses a target sequence that can basically find any segment in human DNA that you want to get to, cut, and insert your own DNA in there as well. So that molecule, if you look here, the artificial linker could be any sequence you want. Meaning, if you put this into an individual or an embryo, you can search through their entire DNA and say, well, I want to take this gene, edit it, I want to remove it, add some new gene, or modify a new gene and rewrite it. Next slide, please. And so, before we go into more details on that, I'd like to give a background about Islam. So Islam is composed of two sects, the Shia and the Sunni sect. These can be compared to Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, and the likes under the Christianity umbrella. And so, Shia and Sunni both refer to the Quran as the main source of Islamic truth. That is to say, in other words, it's the Islamic Bible. Next in line for sources of Islam is al-Sunnah. Al-Sunnah is the stories of the behavior of Prophet Muhammad that have been told and repeated over generational time, and is a guidance for how Muslims should live their lives. The thing that differs Shia from Sunni is how they like to approach making ethical decisions on concepts. And so Sunni believe that consensus analogy is perfectly okay, and that's saying if the community believes that the entire action or decision or item is ethical, then it should be considered as so, based off of Quran and al-Sunnah. And the next thing is analogy, by comparing one thing to the next. However, the Shia believe that this is unacceptable. Just because you have consensus doesn't mean it should be true and it should be right. Because there's, as we know, you can always have a consensus about something that's completely wrong and follow through, as we've seen throughout history. And so reason is probably the next best substitute. Next slide. And so some of y'all have also heard heard of Sharia law. Sharia law is an Islamic government system that is seen in Muslim countries that attempt to protect the following objectives in order of importance. The first being necessity or daruriyat. This is when we have things that make life what it is, and you are required to have it to live and to have faith and a community. Those being faith, life, mind, progeny, and property. The next in line are needed things. These are things that are required, are needed, but they're not essential. These can be things like healthy food or marriage, as an example. And finally, recommended things or luxuries, known as tahsiniyat, which involve things that make life comfortable. So that's saying, things like a nice house, a nice car, nice clothes. Next slide. Now, there are other major ethical maxims within Islam that are also important and that can be interpreted directly from the Quran itself. Those being the ones mentioned here, plus additional ones that are not as significant. The first being the principle of intention. Whether or not the person has good intent to do something. So someone can have bad intentions and do something good, but they'll be judged directly on those bad intentions. The next thing is the principle of certainty, and that's saying whether one thing will have a particular outcome, and that's distinguishing fact from doubt. The next thing is the principle of injury and harm. Every action, every item has consequences, and so we need to judge them based on what type of harm they may have and may contribute to society, and evaluate which are we willing to take a risk on. Principle of necessity is whether or not it is needed, is there an alternative to it? And finally, principle of customs, which is whether or not it coincides with the local ordinance and social norms. Next slide, please. And so, first I'd like to talk about the first CRISPR babies. So in 2018, a scientist named He Jiankhu had reportedly conducted an experiment where he modified the babies to remove the CCR5 gene. Now, as you can see, maybe from this photo, the CCR5 co-receptor here is protruding from the cell, and that is where the HIV molecule will connect to. And so, if that were not there, then it's less likely that the HIV molecule will be expressed by the individual. However, this was particularly done to prevent the children from contacting HIV from their father and in their lifetime in general. Now, 2 female fraternal twins were born in 2018. However, and we just got news in February from an interview with the scientist himself that the babies are actually doing completely fine. However, we don't know the long-term effects, but we'll see it as we go, I suppose. And so the worldwide response was mostly negative, especially from the scientific community, who believed that the experiment was not undergone ethically, and especially because it was experimented on children. And so, next slide, please. And so, this is why we come to our next conversation, which is, how does Islam view this experiment? And so, as mentioned before, we have specific criteria that we can judge the experiment by. And first is intention. What was the actual intention of the scientist? And it appears at first sight that he has good intentions. At the end of the day, it's for therapeutic purposes, and he does want to have the child live health-free from HIV. However, there could be some other intentions that we don't know about, such as being the first person to genetically modify embryos. The next is the certainty of results. Well, CRISPR is relatively new, and so there's not enough data to support if it's safe to conduct on embryos or on humans in general. And so, is there any certainty on that subject or not? I don't think we will know, unless we conduct more research with that. Unintended consequences. Well, what we do know from CRISPR research is that CRISPR can cause different issues when conducting the edit, such as off-target gene modification. So this is to say that different genes on the DNA can be modified unintentionally due to some sort of frameshift mutation. Another issue could be mosaicism, which is when a subset of cells are genetically different from one another. And this is not supposed to happen unless it's your reproductive cells, because it's supposed to be 50% of your somatic cells, DNA. Next is, how does this affect one's behavior? So suppose this individual actually knows that they are never going to contract HIV. Does that make them more promiscuous? And if it does, well, that goes against the whole values that Islam tries to portray. And that, so that's a very sacred thing. Next is future reproduction. Does that affect the individual's ability to have children themselves? Like we spoke about, it does have off-target mutations, so if this is going to affect progeny in the the essential category, then it does have raise some issues there. And finally, was it necessary? So in this case, we're trying to mainly see whether or not the to prevent the kids from inheriting HIV from the father. However, based on studies, we see that the risk of a father transmitting HIV to their children is very, very low, and the risk that a mother transmits HIV to the child is a bit higher. However, there is medication for the mother to take to suppress that from happening. And so, was it necessary? I don't think so. I think there are other alternatives to doing so. Next slide. And so, now we can talk about genetic enhancements. So CRISPR technology can really mean a lot for the future of science. It means that we can think about it, right? Imagine a parent choosing to have a child the same way they choose to have a car. I want this model, this make, this color, this type of lighting. Well, you can do the same thing with a child, and you can say, well, I want them to have this hair color, this IQ, this height, this hair color, length, whatever it is. And so, how does that affect Islam? Well, for one, you're altering God's creation. In Islam, God has created the world perfectly and coherently. However, when it comes to CRISPR, you're starting to make modifications on that, and that is seen as forbidden and unnecessary. The next is the effect on community. So how is this going to affect community? Is using gene editing going to bring the community apart from one another? For example, will it drive individuals to becoming outcast in the society and breaking that structure and family dynamic? And finally, how is it going to affect the individual's soul? Because at the end of the day, if an individual is focusing more on the aesthetics than the moral values of that child or that action, then this is also deviating from Islamic values. There is an exception, though, for therapeutic treatment. Therapeutic treatment, at the end of the day, is very, very significant in Islam because life has a lot of value. Life, at the end of the day, in Islam is significantly important, and so any ways to treat it and to prevent someone from becoming ill is seen as good and valued within Islam. And so an example of that would be having or creating animal hybrids where you can take certain chemicals or compounds that can be used to produce treatment or medicine that would be acceptable in Islam. Next slide. And so with that, I will be concluding my presentation with this question. So what should we consider in future germline gene editing research using CRISPR? With my thesis, I advocate that Islam is one way that we can look at evaluating policy making using CRISPR, especially because it does have a set of values that are shared within all sects of Islam. And in the secular world, we do see a lot of diversity in opinions, and for that, we do need to take everyone's input into consideration, especially because Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and so I do believe that those values and ethical principles should be considered. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, you're a great presenter. I would like to open it up for questions.
Yes.
Now, warned you in advance. But as you were doing your research, what was the most interesting or surprising thing you ran into? That's part of what makes research so much fun to do, is you bump into things you never thought of before.
Yes.
What really struck you?
So during my research, I saw that there was a story about intention within Islam that speaks of two individuals, a man who's done good all his life and followed the rules of Islam, and a man who did the opposite. And at some point, the good guy said he thought he ruined or he wasted his life, and said, I'm going to do bad from here on out. And the bad guy said, I've wasted my life doing all of this nonsense, and I'm going to start doing good. But before they could do either action, they both die. And the story goes, the question is, who goes to heaven and who doesn't? So the guy who did good all his life, even though he thought that he wanted to start doing bad, still goes to heaven because he did good at the end. He never acted on it. The second individual, however, even though he's done bad all his life, he had good intentions and pure intentions to start following Islam. And so for that reason, he also went to heaven. And I think that was very surprising to me because I didn't realize how important intention is. Yes?
You mentioned that we shouldn't alter our physical appearance unless we're doing purpose. Can you give me an example?
Yes, so one example is, for example, you have a very white individual living in a sunny environment, so suppose in the desert or in the Middle East. These individuals are more prone to skin cancers and skin diseases. So suppose you use CRISPR to genetically modify their skin so that they're darker and they have more melanin. This would prevent that. And so even though you're changing the physical appearance and the aesthetic, that would be considered ethical and reasonable within Islam. Any other questions?
Just answered mine.
This is not about your scientific research, but I'm so curious about that standard that you're talking about. What about things like plastic surgery that are for cosmetic purposes? Does that fall in line with the tenets you're talking about?
Yes, so in the Quran, there's actually a verse that talks about altering one's appearance. It doesn't say exactly what, you can imagine back then there wasn't plastic surgery.
But maybe dyeing your hair or something.
Yeah. So altering one's appearance through plastic surgery is technically considered forbidden because you're doing it for aesthetic purposes and not for any therapeutic need. Now, if you're doing, for example, if you're getting a nose job so you can clear out the, I forgot what it's called, but so you can breathe better, that would be fine. That would be considered ethical because at the end of the day you do need it and there's some sort of function for it. Yeah. Yes, Dr.
So a major part of the outcry of the actual history is the fact that the guy who did it without any information, oversight, licensing, he just did it. But since then, many countries have instituted, guidelines and rules about it.
Yes.
In your research, did you find to see what Islamic countries have actually done? How have they interpreted what you did?
Yes.
How have they, in practical terms, are they allowed CRISPR as a whole? Are they allowed for therapeutic reasons? What's been their
So, based on my research, there was one article, I think, from 2020 or 2021 that discussed policies around the world. And they saw that majority of countries, except for 6 countries, banned CRISPR use on humans. There was one Middle Eastern country, which was the UAE, that allowed it with exception for therapeutic purposes. And that's all that they had.
I'm just called that therapeutic versus being more specific?
No, I didn't read into it that much. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Okay, I'm going to take it. I'm so curious, are you going to pursue this interest in graduate school? Do you have the next steps for your research and plan?
Well, it would be very interesting to go into, to start studying CRISPR more. So for graduate school, I'm thinking of studying data science. And so as a bioinformatician, I think data science on top of that would help give me the background and the needs to start going into data research in the healthcare field.
Thank you so much. And now I invite Dr. Sharia to say a few words about working with Saraya, and then to be still her with the chord and sound.
Well, one of the great joys of being a professor is having wonderful students, right? It's a really wonderful thing. And I've had a great deal of fun this last semester. For me, I work in bioethics, as many of you know, and one of the interesting things in bioethics is you go around the world and you interact with other cultures and religions, and you discover there isn't one view, there are many views. And that was what was so interesting about this, and so I was really pleased you were willing to take this on and really approach it from an Islamic perspective, which is an area I do not know well. And so for me, I learned a great deal. It was a lot of fun, so thank you so much. It was a lot of fun. So I'm supposed to do
Yeah, grab one of these.
have official obligations.
Exactly. So you will present this stole to Saraya, and then the honors cord as well.
Here you go.
Yeah.